Welcome back to season 2 of the Game Dev Show. Today I am sitting down with the wonderful Greg Kasavin, founder of and creative director at Supergiant, the studio behind the quite brilliant Bastion, Transistor, Pyre, and 2020 Game of the Year Hades. Greg, sir, how are you doing?
Doing well. Thanks a lot for having me on the show.
Pleasure. No, obviously, I know it's quite early. Early for you? Is it about 8 o'clock?
Yeah, 8:30, not too bad. I'm usually up and around by this hour.
Well, a great way to start the day. You have the joy of
Yeah.
speaking to me for 90 minutes. So, yeah, I mean, obviously, I've read a lot about you. I know that gaming was like being in video games was always your dream, like growing up. And obviously, you've done an incredible job with that dream. You've managed to achieve that dream. I actually also read that you were close to becoming an English professor before an internship at Gamespot changed your career trajectory. Why? What happened there?
Yeah, I started interning at GameSpot kind of just after it launched. So this is back in 1996 to date me immediately. And I had just started college as well. So I was going to school and interning, right? And I was really interested in writing. I love English literature is like what I was majoring in. At the time, like I'm interning at a video game website. It's not necessarily something that you can't like foresee that might lead to a career or something like that. And indeed, my parents at the time, they're like, oh, well, this is fine that you have this, but what are you going to be doing in 5 years? Like that sort of thing. So I was born in Moscow. We immigrated to this country and I was very little. My parents are like these kind of traditional professionals. My mother's a neurologist and my father's an engineer. So their pursuit of the American dream is like, hopefully you'll become, an engineer, a doctor, or a lawyer, pick one, like that sort of thing. So the idea that I would be sort of committed to video games was not necessarily what they could have imagined for me, but was something I always cared about. So the English professor thing, I don't know, is partly just like how I might have imagined quote unquote serious job. And also because I had really mixed experiences with the professors that I had. A handful I really enjoyed, and then others sort of just let the class get out of control, I felt. And that was like really frustrating for me. Similar to like video games, I just like developed a specific opinion on what made for a good English professor. But I don't know that I could be such a person. It was just more of a flight of fancy at the time.
The internship at GameSpot, though, was there a lot of people looking? I mean, for me, it sounds like one in a million, right? Like you just don't see many internships come up.
It absolutely was that. It was an incredible stroke of fortune for me. I've been very, very lucky at certain turns, and that was one of them. I'd started writing about games in high school. As I exited high school, that's when gaming websites were starting to kind of pop up, and some of this transition from print, you had electronic gaming. I mean, you still have magazines like Edge and so on, but it was much more prevalent that gaming coverage was in print, but some was starting to bubble up online, and I started getting into that. And that's how I heard about GameSpot, this realization that, oh, there's actually kind of a pretty big such effort. It started big, from the beginning. It wasn't just like a little garage outfit like what I was doing. It had a big team, it had big ambitions, and it turned out it was practically in walking distance from where I lived. So that's the part that was like ridiculous. If I lived somewhere else in the country, it just wouldn't have happened, let alone somewhere else in the county even. So, that was part of my pitch of like, hey, I work on websites too, want to hang out, like get lunch or something like that. And they responded, and it kind of converted into this internship. And then that converted into a assistant editor position and so on. And I ended up working there for more than 10 years and was editor-in-chief by the end. It started with a big stroke of fortune for sure.
People such as yourself have like these incredible careers, but right at the beginning, there is just this element of luck. Maybe it's location or just being spotted by the right person. But obviously, you've got to put yourself in that position to be seen in the first place. It's fascinating, isn't it? Because, yeah, you had such a long career in journalism before, obviously, founding Supergiant, and we'll speak about that shortly. But one of the things I did want to talk about was you took it kind of to the next level, because in 96, didn't you create Arcadia magazine?
That was the website I was working at. Yeah, it was a small gaming pop culture website that I and two other colleagues of mine kind of whipped up. So that was our attempt to do our own thing. Prior to that, I worked at a small gaming publication. That was like the first kind of real work I got as a game writer was for an old publication called New Type Gaming. And then with a couple of colleagues from there, we did the Arcadia thing, kind of split off on our own. We did that for about a year, and that basically led to each of us getting opportunities elsewhere, including GameSpot in my case. It's what gave me the experience to be able to say, hey, I do write reviews for websites. I do this kind of stuff. So it helped me be qualified for that.
Were you ever tempted to carry on with Arcadia, or was it a case of actually, this was always our intention to have it as a stepping stone?
I think we had more ambitions about it at the beginning. I was like, how old was I? I was like 17 years old or something like that, right? It was more one step at a time. We had some ambitions around it, but the moment I heard about GameSpot and it's like, oh, they have a team of 20 people, they have like an office location, I'm like, okay, this is legitimate at a level that we are not. They were like, the ambitions of something like GameSpot were far, far greater than our little kind of 3-person. It was more of like a hobbyist thing. But we were starting to get, publishers sending us review code for things and stuff like that. We didn't have any funding or anything. It was all self-funded.
Wow.
It's just seeing how we could make like a business out of it, which was through like advertising revenue at that time, that sort of thing.
I think it's quite hard. I always encourage my friends to try and do their own thing as much as possible. And I know at some point, like, everyone works for someone or a company, but I always think that it's quite courageous to be able to be like, actually, we'll try our own thing. And you get security from having an employer, if you like, that you don't get doing your own thing.
Yeah, which can be a false sense of security at times, but for sure, it makes certain things easier. But yeah, particularly if there's something that you wish, existed in the world, but does not, that is a really good motive to go do your own thing if you have the means.
Yeah, I think that in particular definitely applies to video game design. I think everyone's always thinking about games that they think should be made and haven't been made, and then they go off and make them, and then they realize they never should have been made, or they're really lucky. But I mean, yeah, I think it just sounds like a dream job. I mean, I remember when I was younger, it must have been about 13, 14, but I applied for a job at PC Gamer. They were like looking for junior writers, and I'm not a great writer or anything, but I thought, oh, do you know what? I love video games. And I remember sending in a review of Typing of the Dead on the PC.
Oh, yeah. I like that game.
It's great. It was so good. It was very niche, but they never got back to me, which was tragic. But from Arcadia, you obviously, you went off to GameSpot, as you mentioned. And it was almost like it feels like it was one of the golden ages of video games, if you like, from the mid 90s to the mid noughties. Can you tell us about this? What was it like to be there at this time?
It was intense for sure. I think the standards that we set were high. Our goal was to review every game, which sounds today, it's like, that's absurd. That's impossible. But in fairness, there were way fewer games at the time. Like, there was not much of any kind of self-publishing. Steam didn't exist. iPhones didn't exist. The number of new releases was much more kind of finite. You'd go to a video game store and you'd see, a few new games pop up, maybe more than a few, every month or something like that. And we're like, we're going to review every single game, and we're going to do it to a high standard, and we're going to do it on time, all this kind of stuff. But, things constantly evolve. The standards for what like a website even is would evolve every couple of years. So we'd have to do these big like site redesigns, which were always these really intense moments of having to kind of convert all the old content while making sure the new site was stable, making sure the new site actually did a good job of presenting the stuff that we were writing. At GameSpot, we were big pioneers of internet video, not just on gaming websites, but just period. We did some of the first kind of live streaming video of any website or publication. So we were, live streaming E3 events and really wild stuff like that, kind of at the intersection of gaming coverage and just kind of like internet technology. But, all through it, we were just kind of reviewing a lot of games. And as you say, it was an exciting time for games, not just on, in the PC space. There were these like legendary games like the Half-Life series and what have you. And then meanwhile on console, you had these things like the Dreamcast launch and the PlayStation 2 and later the Xbox and the Xbox 360 and all this kind of stuff. those are all like kind of classic consoles now or whatever. But I think for many people, those are foundational gaming experience. For me, I was in my 20s, or late teens for most of that stuff. But for many players, that's like their first gaming memories might be a PlayStation 2 game or something like that. I mean, I think we could kind of tell that it was an incredible time for games, even in the moment. One of the things I'd always say is every year, there's games that we would anticipate every year that we'd be excited about, but there would always be the surprises too. And I would look forward to those surprises. It's like, what's the stuff that I have no idea exists, and that's just going to come out of nowhere and completely, blow us away. And it would happen with kind of amazing regularity. There was a ton of work, and it kind of never slowed down. But the part where it let me justify playing a ton of video games was always a big part of the appeal. That's why I got into writing about games, actually, because I was just playing them so much. I felt like I had to do something productive with it. Not to say that playing games isn't productive, but you know what I mean. I felt like I just had to do something more with it to justify how much time I was already spending playing stuff.
During your period there, you speak about like there were constantly games that like shocked you, like of how good they were. Was there any particular that you remember and you were like, wow, we just never expected that?
There are quite a few. The ones that like snap to mind immediately are these were they're kind of halfway through, more toward the end of my time there. Actually, both GameCube games. One is Metroid Prime and one is Resident Evil 4.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
Resident Evil 4 is maybe the one I would single out as like a game where it just felt as though someone delivered this game from the future. Like a time traveler arrived from like 5 years from, what was it, 2004, I think? And the time traveler said, here is a video game from my time. It was just so far ahead of what other kind of like action adventure shooter type of games were doing from like a presentation standpoint that I was shocked at the level of like sheer quality of that game. It was this big departure for the series. It changed all the controls. It changed like in many aspects of the theme. So not only was it just like really incredible in its entire presentation, it was also very bold in its design. So I was just kind of baffled, like how could such a thing exist when many games are take more like incremental steps, I guess. But there are breakthrough games again, throughout history, there are breakthrough games at least every so often. Like I grew up playing a ton of fighting games, like Street Fighter 2 was one of these like landmark games where there were other games about two characters kind of beating each other up, but not nearly on the level of the kind of sophistication and depth of Street Fighter 2 is just like another completely revolutionary game.
Yeah, they're almost like genre defining titles. Yeah. I love Street Fighter. I used to main Ken. Yeah. I used to love Ken. Yeah, I personally my favorite Street Fighter is Third Strike, and I know it's almost like the one that a lot of people don't love, but I love the parry mechanic. And it also gave us one of our greatest moments, I think, in modern competitive gaming with Daigo versus
Justin Wong. Yeah.
Justin Wong, yeah.
Third Strike is amazing. Like Third Strike was they updated it. It was the second update. They had Second Impact and then Third Strike. By Third Strike, that game was amazing. I was like so on the original Street Fighter 3 release, but I still listened to like the soundtrack from Third Strike. It was an amazing game. Yeah,
I do think it's crazy, obviously not to digress too much, but I think it's crazy that, because I love Tekken as well. I actually love beat 'em ups in general, but I think it's crazy that no one has tried to replicate the parry mechanic in Street Fighter, because it was the definition of a risk reward, right? You almost had to be frame perfect to parry. And I know you've got reversals in like, Tekken, but I'm very surprised no one's taken the risk and said, actually, we're going to replicate this. We're going to do the same parry mechanic. But
yeah, there's definitely similar stuff in fighting games, but in terms of the like mechanic of tapping forward instead of back, that was one of the really interesting things about it. It's like you don't back away from it, you actually like push into the attack to parry it. Yeah.
And I remember like first trying to parry
just take all these hits.
Like, and I just remember, even now I remember it was like twice, and then there's like a split second gap, and then you do the next 3 hits and you can parry his entire super. Yeah, also Resident Evil 4, like I think It's interesting, isn't it? But yeah, they are definitely like, defining titles. Resident Evil 4, I remember the first time you're upstairs and the villagers put the ladder against so they can get upstairs and through the window, and you're like, well, where am I? What's happening? And from GameSpot, though, you obviously had a fantastic career at GameSpot. You were there at one of the best times in gaming. You actually went to EA and became a producer. Can you tell us about that move?
Yeah. So at the start of 2007, it was like the very first week. That's when I left GameSpot. GameSpot is up here in Northern California and San Francisco, and drove down to Los Angeles to start this job at Electronic Arts. I'd wanted to make games since I was a little kid, like 8 or something like that. But in my attempts to teach myself programming as a kid, I just struggled with it. I tried on several different occasions and just, I don't know, maybe I just didn't try and learn it the correct way. But be that as it may, the parts that did stick with me was the playing of games and the writing about them. So, it led to this, like writing about them as an editor and critic for many years. But I never lost sight of the part where I hoped to one day try to make them. But the time at GameSpot just flew by. Like suddenly it was 10 years later. I'm in my late 20s now. I just started to feel this kind of sense of desperation that I'm no closer to this other dream of mine. And if I don't bite the bullet and try it, first of all, I'm going to regret it. And second of all, I don't know how many chances I'll ever have to do it if I don't try it soon. And once again, it was another stroke of fortune for me, was that a former colleague of mine from GameSpot named Amir Ajami, I worked with him for a number of years, and he moved on at some point to go work as a producer at Electronic Arts in Los Angeles. So he worked on Command and Conquer Generals and the Battle for Middle-earth games, stuff like that. So he worked on real-time strategy games there. I kept in touch with him still as a friend. He knew of my interests in this. And, one day he asked me, like, are you still ever thinking about game development? Because we're looking for another producer here. I applied for that position and got it. Amir really helped show me the ropes over there. It was a weird experience for me because, first of all, I was in a totally different environment in Los Angeles. GameSpot was like my first real job. So it's strange to go from working with one set of people. I'm not the sort of person for whom meeting new people is easy. So just having to like learn a whole new set of people, a whole new organization, and a whole new skill set, right? Because it's a completely different thing in a lot of ways. But yeah, I think on the very first day is when I met another Amir Rao, and Gavin Simon. Amir Rao was a designer, like a campaign mission designer, and Gavin was like a hybrid technical designer and AI engineer over there. And they became friends of mine, among others, and they would later leave and co-found Supergiant, where I am today. I came in right at the tail end of development of a game called Command and Conquer 3, which was like a big return for, a then really well-known real-time strategy series. It was an exciting project. Yeah, I got to like get involved and just sort of manage this process of, trying to be as useful as possible without getting underfoot during a busy time in production. The first game then I worked on start to finish was Red Alert 3. That was the subsequent game we made in about 18 months or something like that. And then we made an expansion pack for that game, and then we started working on projects that did not see the light of day. So this was about 2.5 years later, and that's when we started thinking about Supergiant. My path still took different turns at that point, but EA, I met amazing people there, including some of whom I still work with to this day, and I learned so much kind of so quickly. It was an amazing team. And a lot of that team is like, although it's split up, a lot of the people are like still together in different places in the industry, which is cool. It's like the bonds on that team were very strong.
It's so interesting because my favorite RTS of all time was actually General Zero Hour. Again, it's not like mainstream Command and Conquer games, but Zero Hour was probably one of the best expansions I've ever seen. In terms of content that they added. And I think it's great. You've always had this bond with those people. With Command and Conquer, was it quite, because obviously working as a producer and doing the writing, it must have been very different because Command and Conquer is quite unanimous with cheesy writing and very very dramatic.
On Command and Conquer 3, I wrote the manual, which was great. I love again, I come from an era of games where they included instruction manuals, And I always enjoyed reading like game instruction manuals as a kid. Like some games went out of their way to have really fantastic manuals, and they always left an impression on me. So Command and Conquer 3 and Red Alert 3 after it both had printed manuals. So I was very excited to be able to write a manual for that game. But then on Red Alert 3, I contributed quite a bit of writing. Like I did a lot of the unit responses, like the little things that guys say when you click on them. I did the tutorial for that game. I love the tutorial in Red Alert 3. It's very quirky. And I think we did a lot of fun stuff with it. I think the writing in Red Alert 3 is really fun. Not to pat myself on the back, I'm only one of several. Like people still, share the Tim Curry, space meme on the internet. That's from Red Alert 3. Like that was fantastic at the time, and it's fantastic now. The cast was amazing. I didn't work on any of the main cinematic stuff, but I love unit responses in real-time strategy games, like from StarCraft and Warcraft 2 and stuff like that, and being able to like bring these little tanks and army men and stuff like that to life was really one of my favorite aspects of the work. The audio team there was incredible. There's a different audio director on Command and Conquer 3 than on Red Alert 3, but they're both fantastic. And now I work with Darren Korb, who's our audio director at Supergiant. So I've been very, very blessed to work with like absolute genius kind of audio people because I love game audio stuff.
Yeah, they've got to bring it to life, don't they? Right? Like you can write this incredible content, but you need someone to almost execute what you're trying to deliver. It's interesting because I'm playing Common Heroes 2 with some friends at the moment, and the VO from the soldiers that you click on is like incredible. Like Common Hero 2 is probably one of the most visceral games I think you can play. Are you still a fan of RTS?
They're not as many of them now. As I guess there's there's still the Total War games and stuff like that. The traditional RTS has been sort of dormant, right? I want to say yes, but also I haven't played an RTS in a while. Oddly, the one that really, what was it called? I played a ton of a game called Clash Royale when it first came out. I was really impressed with Clash Royale, which is like a little mobile single screen RTS game. I thought there was some genius stuff going on in that game as like a way of removing a lot of the noodly complexity of real-time strategy games, but distilling it down to like the most kind of significant decisions. So I was very impressed with the design and played that game for months. I certainly keep an eye on the genre, but I haven't been keeping up with the StarCraft 2 multiplayer scene or anything like that.
The meta. It is pretty crazy. I think at the moment, RTS is about to have almost its own renaissance, right? You have Age of Empires 4, Company Heroes 3, and what Total War games are always coming up. But even it's great to see the indie scene. They've started to embrace it more and more. And would you ever be tempted to try and make one, or is the bond not there enough?
I don't know. Like Amir, Gavin, and I, we have a ton of love for this genre. It's like where we come from, right? Like there's a lot of indirect influence from those games in our games at Supergiant, which I don't think anyone would ever guess. But things like the isometric perspective that we use in Hades, that's like from working on Command and Conquer. It's just like a perspective that we're really like the sort of balance that it provides between having a sense of like situational awareness, and you could get pretty close to everything, but you're not having to, particularly in our games, they're not having to worry about, camera controls or any of that sort of thing. Of course, in RTS games, there's a ton of moving the camera around. I don't know what we'll go on to make in the future. Who knows? Maybe we will feel the urge to try something like that.
A Hades set RTS. You just never know.
Transistor and Pyre are second and third games. Now that I'm saying this stuff, maybe a listener can see where there's some kind of connection, some RTS influence or something like that. But, we've never done a very straight ahead genre game. There's maybe Hades is kind of straight ahead as kind of a rogue light action RPG type of thing. But we're always trying to do things a little bit differently, if only so that our work has a chance of standing out. That was the thought with Bastion, our first game. It's like we love, Diablo 2, which, then the king of action RPGs. We want to make an action RPG, but we had no chance of making an action RPG that could go toe to toe with Diablo 2 in terms of the level of content, the types of features. So approaching it from a different perspective, having like sort of a narrative context to justify all the stuff that it doesn't do. There's only you can't have multiplayer if you're in a world where everybody's dead. If you're the last survivor, then there's no expectation of multiplayer. That's honestly how we were thinking about it. Just like, how do we justify the limitations of this game, like through the narrative?
Yeah, I think it's brilliant. I'm definitely going to ask you about that in a moment. But I wanted to know about like the founding of Supergiant. I mean, I know you've alluded to, you've obviously created this bond with friends, right? Essentially like these close people, but it's still a big leap to then be like, right, we're going to go and do our own thing. Like, what was the thought process behind that and how did it come about?
Yeah, so this is back in 2009. So as mentioned, we were kind of in between projects at Electronic Arts. Being between projects is a time for reflection anyway. What do you want to work on? What do you hope to do? We're playing a lot of independent games. It was like kind of speaking of Renaissance periods, that was a time when games like Braid, Castle Crashers, and Plants vs. Zombies, and World of Goo came out. So those are the four that I very vividly remember from that era and bring up. And we were playing these games and just blown away by their quality, especially relative to their small team size. These are games made by kind of handfuls of people. And we realized that like the quality was not despite the small team size. It was like the small team size enabled these really kind of uniquely personal feeling, highly specific games to exist. And then, these new kind of digital platforms like Xbox Live Arcade were enabling these like smaller creators to put their work out there. So the days of having to like create, $60 worth of game and put it on a disc in like a GameStop store or whatever, it was like there were starting to be more options. You could make a smaller game, sell it for less money, and it could find an audience based on some of these successes. So that's when we started talking about what would we do, what would we make. And there came a moment where Amir and Gavin bit the bullet, left their jobs at EA, and drove up back to Northern California. Amir is from San Jose, which is about 90 minutes from San Francisco. His father's house was like vacated at the time. He was abroad. So they just moved into the living room of that house in San Jose and started working on what would become Bastion. I did not join them at the time. One thing I didn't get into is I was commuting to Los Angeles from San Francisco for that 2.5-year period. My home was up here in Northern California. My wife and at the time young daughter, I would fly down to Los Angeles for 2 weeks at a time, come up for a weekend, go back, and that's not a process I expected to drag out as long as it did, but it did. And I was like at a point in my own life where I just needed desperately to kind of stabilize my life. And the idea of going from the situation I was in at EA into like a startup company, an hour and a half from my home, it was all too much. And I fortunately got an opportunity at 2K Games in the publishing team there. And 2K Games is like a reasonable commute from where I live, like for the first time in a long time. I thought our paths, were forking at that time, but I reunited with Amir and Gavin the following year as Bastion was about to head into production. We kept talking, and my son was just born. It was still in many ways, like on paper, like a still like really ill-advised decision because 2K was great. I enjoyed the team I was working with, but then I had this chance to work with my friends and to kind of get my hands dirty on a game in a way I'd never been able to before. Make levels, write the story, like all this sort of stuff. I had to sort of kind of leech off of my parents for the first time since I was a teenager, like to help support me. For the first year, I had to like make the case to them. And thankfully, again, I just had the means through their help to be able to accept the opportunity. And, then I was working with Amir and Gavin again. We had this project that we were super excited about where for the first time, kind of our fates were in our own hands. Part of the appeal of being a small team like that is we're going to live and die by our own decisions. We're not going to be part of like a gigantic product plan across a big company. We're just going to try and do what's best for our game and for each other and do the best work we can, like cram all our best ideas into it and see what happens. Yeah, that's kind of how that all went over.
Yeah, and it went over pretty well, I think, with a lot of people who played Bastion. Like, I completed Bastion years back. God, it seems like so long ago now, but I remember
Yeah.
playing it on through Xbox Live Arcade, and I remember at the time, like games like Braid. And it's interesting when you look at Bastion. I always look at Braid. I think a lot of it's because of the art style in some ways. I know it's isometric, but Bastion's fantastic,
Thank you.
absolutely brilliant. Like, it's interesting, is it? Whenever we have people on the show, when you speak to them about like their first like indie experience, there's always a twinkle in the eye compared to not compared to where they are now, but there's such a fondness there because it's so intimate, right? And like you really are just making something with your mates.
We still are. I've said on numerous occasions, like for me, it's never gotten any easier. Like it's always been hard, and it gets harder in like new and different ways. I think the challenge is part of the draw. I think I was drawn to games in part because of the sense of challenge and the reward that comes from, overcoming whatever obstacles the game puts before you. I'm just so incredibly grateful that we've been able to make these games on our own terms and that they found an audience, because Supergiant was self-funded. The Bastion team grew to 7 people, and then we were 12 people for the longest time, and we grew to about 20 for Hades, since we were going to get the game out there so quickly in early access, and just knew that we wanted it to be a bigger game. But yeah, we've been around now, since 2009, so 12 plus years. We're still pretty small, and we make one big new thing at a time. We try to make games that are true to our values, and kind of like games that are built around the specific individuals that we have, like our skill sets, and just try to do the most with what we can. And it's been really, we just want to see how long we can keep going for. Unlike with GameSpot, where, I had no idea what the future would hold, I think with Supergiant, there was always, at least after Bastion came out, and didn't bomb, we were like, let's see if we could just stick together and keep doing this. That was, it's a pretty simple,
It's such
like,
humble
that's what the
beginnings.
ambition is. Yeah.
Incredibly cool. You did just touch upon it, but with Bastion, for me, the narrator, right, like talking
Yeah.
about your journey, like we had Pasi Pitcairn, who's the head of audio at Rovio, come on. I think it was at the end of season 1, and he was talking about how audio is the like brain's emotional engine. So when you think back at games, you always think of like the audio elements, which is very interesting and very, very true. For Bastion, it's the same with Darkest Dungeon, right? Like the narrator is such a fantastic feature. What inspired it? Was it just because it was in Diablo?
No. So what inspired it was we wanted to explore narrative more in the action RPG genre. We felt that there was an opportunity there, that even though games like Diablo do have, characters and story, it's not really a central element of those games, I think, in fairness. We were interested to see if there could be a more narrative rich version of a game like that, in part, like I said, both because we wanted to create something that could feel meaningful, and also for the reasons I mentioned, that we wanted it to create a setting where you weren't constantly thinking about all the things that we couldn't do in the game, right?
Yeah.
Like 10-player multiplayer and 10 million weapons and all this kind of stuff. Our goal there was, can we have a narrative that does not interrupt the player's experience? We didn't want, cutscenes and walls of text and these kind of things that are like constantly interrupting your progress. It was a tough problem. We didn't have a solution right away, but one day it was something Amir decided to try, in part because he is a longtime friend of Logan Cunningham, who's the voice of the narrator in Bastion and has been a featured character or many characters in some cases in each of our games since. He's the voice of Hades and Achilles and others in Hades. So basically Amir's like, hey, can you record some stuff? I want to try just putting voiceover into this game and seeing what that does. And at the time, Bastion was just all like temp art, like scanned from Dungeons and Dragons books. It was just all like early prototype stuff. But the moment Logan's voice got in the game, you felt something. It had an effect that was interesting, and it happened to align with the story ideas that we were mulling, which was always going to involve the game was always called Bastion. You were going to get to this mysterious location with its mysterious caretaker, with his plan to restore the world. And it's like, oh, wait, the story could just be told from the perspective of this guy. That's basically how the narration technique was born. And then the part where it became very like pervasive through the game, that was just like, we'd have some of Logan's voiceover in the game. It would be really cool. And then you'd get to the end of it, and then you're just playing it blank, like there's no more voiceover anymore. And it's like, wait a minute, it feels so bad when he's not there. We just have to have him throughout the entire thing. And then, you know, the little moments of reactivity felt really exciting. But we thought that the narration in Bastion would be more polarizing. We thought it would be more of like a love it or hate it feature, but it was like there were very few hate it's on the balance. We were very pleased to find. Yeah,
I think it was a brilliant decision. Again, similar to the Street Fighter parry in Third Strike and Street Fighter 3. It's surprising that it's not used more, because I think it was an incredible way to tell the story in Bastion.
It's not that we didn't think anything of it, but like for me, you know, it was these games like Max Payne and Prince of Persia: The Sands of Time that made really good use of narration. I'm like, oh, we could just, you know, we could spin it kind of like those games. But I think the part where we were just all in on this one technique is what made it stand out. But it was partly like a practicality issue. Like we couldn't make cutscenes and things like that. Like the narration was the actual like tool that we had. So we just had to like filter all the narrative through that. And yeah, it did work out really well for that game. And I'll be the first to admit that like we certainly did not invent like narration in video games. There were a number of games that did it extraordinarily well, but they had their other, you know, Max Payne tells its story in a variety of ways, and so does Prince of Persia. Whereas with Bastion, that's all we had.
Yeah. I do hope that developers continue to explore like audio, VO as like a mechanism for delivering like a more emotive experience, because I do think that it is often it's just so powerful. I think good audio is just so powerful.
I call it our not so secret weapon. It is a huge part of each of our games. Darren's work on the music and the voiceover. It's just we care a lot about the atmosphere of our games. Although the visuals are what you know kind of experience first and most immediately, and of course are a huge part of the atmosphere of our games. Like it brings like all the realism in a way, because you know the visuals can be fantastical and stylized and so on, but the audio, you know, it's real human voices and things like that. It just kind of like makes you believe the world in a really remarkable way. Yeah. So I fully agree that audio is one of the like unsung hero may not be the right term, but it's like an underrated in some respects aspect of how like when a game has great audio, it can't be that bad. Like every game with amazing audio, it's already like pretty good just automatically in my own experience.
I don't know. Again, like you remember like a lot of the VO moments and like clips and music. I mean, talking obviously music and audio, like Hades. Obviously, we're gonna have to talk about Hades at some point. I know you've talked about it a lot. Again, one of the very few games that I've actually completed. And everyone I speak to, I was speaking to a colleague before we started recording, and I said, obviously, like, you know, meeting with yourself today, and yeah, he was just like, man, like Hades is one of the best games of recent. Everybody who's played it has that same feedback, and I just wanted to learn, because obviously everyone's spoken about the success, and I almost want to avoid that and actually ask you, what have you learned from developing Hades?
Yeah, I mean, we've learned a lot. Hades was a lot of firsts for us, even though it's a game that was like very intentionally our kind of return to a lot of things that we had done before and enjoyed doing. It's the first game that we planned. That may sound a bit, I don't know if that sounds silly or not, but all of our previous games were born from like a very like exploratory kind of process. Just try stuff, throw stuff at the wall, see what sticks, build it out piece by piece, see where it goes. With both Transistor and Pyre, our second and third games, that did lead to a sense of kind of wandering in the woods in pre-production and a lot of stuff not working until eventually you have some kind of like breakthrough and something kind of sticks and you build from there. With Hades coming onto our fourth game, first of all, we were like concerned that why are we just kind of starting over every single time we make a game? We've made these settings that we enjoy, and we've made these kind of like game systems that we also find really rich. And yet every time we start a new game, we feel compelled to kind of wipe the slate completely clean, ban those good ideas from like other games are taking influence from our games, but we're not allowed to kind of build on our own ideas, by making something new each time. We're making this needlessly frustrating. Why are we doing this? Why not just kind of plan a game a little bit more intentionally and see how that goes? And Hades was the result of that. It was also our first ever early access game. So part of the plan was also, hey, let's quickly make this sort of like minimum viable product, quote unquote, just like let's express what this game is going to be all about, but in an incomplete form, put it out there, see what people think. If they like it, great. We could keep working on it for a while and make the most of it. If they don't like it, well, we could wind it down and try something else. Before, with Transistor and Pyre, it's like you work on something for 3 years, find out if it's any good, then make another one. And it's like, man, if we play test and stuff along the way, right? It's really not the same as kind of putting it out there to a bigger audience. So we expected that the feedback that we would get from players would help us stay focused on the most important things, what's lacking, what are the biggest opportunities in the game. We were correct in that assessment. The early access feedback was extremely useful. The other sort of hypothesis was that an early access game could still like have a narrative. These are games that typically are like very systems driven, kind of replayability driven. If you have a traditional game with kind of a beginning, middle, and end in early access, the problem you're going to run into is that your players will just burn through all the content, and then you won't have much of or your community will just be clamoring for like more story. You may not be able to fulfill that as a developer. But by structuring Hades around replayability, we still felt like we had an opportunity to build the narrative trappings into it, similar to how we approached the action RPG in Bastion. Because thinking about roguelike games, it was an intimidating genre to step into with so many great games in there, like Slay the Spire and Binding of Isaac and Dead Cells, like these games that were amazing to us. So we thought we had no chance of competing with those kind of games head on. So we just thought, let's do something that's kind of off to the side and make narrative more a part of it. Yeah, that worked out really well in early access as well. And I think what we learned, to come back to your question, is like we shouldn't have been so afraid of planning our games. It actually worked out really well. Early access can absolutely work for the kind of games, at least for a game like Hades, and not for all kinds of games, but at least for the kind of thing that we made. And we were right also to grow the team. We intend to stay small, which we define as around our current size of about 20 people. But going from 12 to 20 is a big, percentage change. But the new voices, the new folks who joined our team, were absolutely instrumental to that game being what it is. So it's scary to grow the team in that way, because we're so mindful of the kind of chemistry that we have on the team. But it was absolutely the right decision. So it was a bunch of scary stuff that we did, but each game we want to feel a bit out of our creative comfort zone on each game we make. There's some thrill in like, oh God, like is this
what's happening?
We're doomed, the kind of C3PO, like we're doomed. At least for me, it's like I'm more pessimistic in my disposition. So it's like, oh God, what have we done? But it's worked out for us, right? So it's like I come to recognize that even though my instinct is pessimism, it's like, no, wait, that's the same pessimism that led to, our other things turned out okay. So this is good pessimism. I try to tell myself.
It definitely was good pessimism. I mean, and it definitely obviously did work out. I think when you compare it to obviously those other roguelike games, which were all brilliant, I do think the narration is that's what I enjoyed about it. Like the narration, obviously I know that's what I identify in games and what I enjoy when I'm playing something. And I suppose that's an element that wasn't as present in those other titles. And probably it was never intended to be. So
right.
With Hades, though, you obviously it's set within Greek mythology. I actually went to the Acropolis in Athens in 3 weeks ago with my girlfriend.
Amazing.
Yeah, and it's incredible. Yeah. Like it's I love Greek history. Basically, I think it's fantastic.
Yeah.
Did you find, obviously this is your first game where there was like this real historic element? there was like some fact to it. Obviously the gods have
Yeah.
their names, etc., and their personalities like shone through. Did you find that more restrictive, or was it a case of, you know, it actually inspired more creativity?
It was more scary, that's for sure. I wasn't concerned about it being more restrictive because all worlds have their rules and boundaries. You just either have to make them up yourself or derive that information from other sources. It was, yeah, Hades is our first kind of adaptation, right? Like our first 3 games are all in their original settings, and we're really lucky to have been able to work on all 4 of our games are in their own worlds and stuff like that. It's just been such a treat and something we love doing, and we've you know, our players have enjoyed it as well. So it's like, oh, let's just, it's great that we have like developed some experience around doing this. And to me, it almost felt like those first 3 games were like training for something like Hades, because our games have always had like a component of mythology to them, even Transistor. So the thought of like adapting an existing mythology for our 4th game was like, oh, that's different. You know, we wanted to do it because it was so different and scary. We had become accustomed to just making our own stuff up from scratch. The part where, you know, I think we all instinctively knew that we wanted to honor the source material and approach with something like Greek myth. There's a similar question with the roguelike genre, a similar question with Greek myth. Like, what business do you have creating a work in this genre? Because many excellent works already exist. What is your point of view here that hasn't already been done before? Why should your thing come to light? And we ask ourselves those questions, you know, in as direct terms as I just put it. We have to have like preliminary answers to them to decide why we're even going to try it. And, you know, with roguelikes, like I said, it was the idea of this sort of like a narrative roguelike. We felt that the genre had a lot of rich potential for storytelling. Like the structure could be really interesting for a story. And then for Greek myth, we felt that taking the point of view, like focusing on the family dynamics, the kind of big dysfunctional family of the Olympians, we felt, I personally felt that was oddly, like most modern works of Greek myth, they don't seem directly inspired by classical mythology. I was very drawn to like drawing from the source as much as possible. I love works like the Iliad. And so, and the really like complicated portrayals of the gods in the source material, where they're not like what most people would consider good people. They do a lot of questionable things. So capturing that, maybe not all the specifics of classical myth, but the spirit of the gods being like kind of fickle and, you know, sometimes backstabbing each other and you know, prone to selfishness and these kind of just being, you know, in a word, human, despite being gods. Like that was really compelling to us. And we felt like we hadn't really seen that done. And the focus on the underworld in particular, like, you know, all these adaptations of Greek myth, but you never see like Nyx, who is the night itself. Like these are amazing characters from Greek myth that never, forgive the expression, see the light of day, right? So we didn't know why the underworld gods would like almost never be shown, but we were like, okay, well, let's find out. Maybe we're missing something or making a stupid mistake, but we're gonna just see how it goes. And obviously it turned out really, really well for us. Yeah.
You do a lot of Supergiant, don't you? Because I know I was reading you did like the VO of Hypnos.
Yeah.
And you do the writing, and you obviously, you know, you're very integral to the design, and like it's a lot of hats to wear, I guess. And like it's as expected at an indie, but as you've grown, I guess, do you find you have less time for each element as projects naturally grow? I mean, what is your creative process like?
I sort of like protect that time. You know, I think at Supergiant, we're really aware of the phenomenon of sort of like getting promoted out of doing the stuff that you love. All 7 of us from the Bastion days, we're all still there. And we all still basically do a lot of the same stuff that we've always done because we love it. But we've always had other responsibilities as well. So in some respects, nothing has changed. But in other respects, you're absolutely right, where we do have a bigger team. We do have more kind of games in our catalog, and Hades is like a bigger game than our previous game. So we are like busier with other stuff but that's part of the reason we have more help. Hades has the highest word count of any of our games. So like I didn't do less stuff, I did more stuff, kind of objectively. At least speaking personally, it's like I like it. I still love being hands-on with the work itself. I don't want to not do that stuff. We try to be very mindful of all the responsibilities that we have, and scheduling things properly is really, really challenging, but something that we have been practicing. For us, when the goal is to stick together and keep making games for as long as we can, the sustainability of the enterprise is a huge part of it. Like we just have to create a set of circumstances in an environment where people can work in a way that they're comfortable with, that they could, keep doing, rather than like burning the candle at both ends and then, not wanting to do the work anymore. It's tough. We definitely get pulled away onto other things, but we catch ourselves, when we're working on the game directly, we still love that as much as ever. Part of being small also means like having to say no to sometimes exciting opportunities. Like we can't do everything, right? We have to really pick and choose and focus. And those are hard decisions that can come up, but we know we got to do them.
I think that's the thing. Like, like when you say like you got to stay, obviously throughout the development process, you have to kind of rein yourself in sometimes. And like, do you ever find that you're creating titles, because obviously I think of Supergiant and I think of these incredibly vibrant, isometric, narrative-led experiences. Do you ever find that you can't create something outside of that because there's an expectation from your player community as well as your team?
Not really. I don't think about it in those terms. I think we have an amazing player community that came to us in the first place because they were open to different kinds of experiences. So like, with Transistor, our second game, we were very concerned, very worried going into the announcement of that game, because we thought we might get, eaten alive because we had this new game as opposed to like Bastion 2, right? A lot of people who enjoyed Bastion, they're like, this is great, can't wait for the sequel. And we're like, so we were very worried then. The announcement of Transistor was met with great enthusiasm, much more than we expected. So I think it was from that moment onward that we became like a bit more like courageous in thinking that, as long as we're making something that's kind of true to our values, anything we make is really, the main audience of our games is people who've enjoyed our games in the past. So even if we change settings or change formats, like all we're really trying to do is make an experience for players who've enjoyed our games that can make them feel those feelings again. Part of that means, creating that sense of surprise and wonder. If you're just kind of retreading the same stuff over and over, it becomes very familiar, and the sense of like wonder and delight isn't there anymore. So we really value that excitement of like going into something that doesn't feel the same as a place you've already been. And then the other part of it is just that, as I mentioned before, we build games like around the team that we have, rather than thinking of game ideas and then going like, oh, now we need the team to create this game. The members of our team are almost like in a very real way, they're the ingredients of our games. They're like what goes into our games. So we ask ourselves, it's like a chef analogy. It's like, well, we have this stuff. What can we make with this stuff? We're happy with our games feeling like, as people are like, oh, it feels like a game from Supergiant. And we used to be like, what do you mean by that? But I think when the connotation there is positive, we're perfectly happy with it. Like we want to keep improving at what we do and keep doing new things as well. But, as long as, Darren Korb is doing all our music, as long as Gen Z is our art director, or what have you, like, I think it's no accident that our games have certain threads in common, because it's the same people working on them. We're not trying to like disguise the fact that we're the same team over time, right? So we like Darren and Amir, they used to be in bands together, so they have a nice like band analogy of like they just it's just a band sticking together over time. From album to album, a band can be very different, but you could usually still tell it's it's the same band. Yeah, and sometimes the members of the band will change, but the identity is still there. And we think of some of those legendary bands that have been together like for decades and stuff like that. Like it's much more uncommon in games. So I think the band thing has been appealing to us as more of like an aspirational thing. I think of like New Order or something that's been around, some of these guys like playing music together since like the 70s, still doing it. It's amazing to me.
Do you ever on that analogy, do you look back at Supergiant? Do you have a favorite album? Do you have a favorite project?
Like among our games? It's hard. No, I mean, I love them all. It's like choosing between children almost, which I also say about, I use that sort of cop out answer, but like, Bastion was a really unique experience for me, I will say, because Bastion was the one where like, that was our first one for me, like on a personal level for me, that was the first time I got to like write the story, make levels. I'll never forget Bastion in that respect. Like each game has had really memorable experiences for me. Like I think I did a lot of my best work on Pyre. Transistor was a game that was like very much from the heart, very like personal in a lot of ways. And then of course Hades is like our team just connected in a way like never before, leading to this result that was like even bigger than what we'd done in the past. Hades was like really, it was intense to work on, but super, super fun to work on with all the characters. And we were just really efficient at like making Hades stuff, for our small team. Like at the beginning, we're like, maybe people will be able to play this game for 50 hours. Games like Bastion and Transistor, you could finish in easily under 10 hours. So the idea of making a bigger game was wild to us, but people play Hades for like hundreds of hours. It was,
you got speedrunners and competitions.
Yeah, exactly. So like, we couldn't have imagined that it would be enjoyed so deeply. And that's again, it's like very gratifying, and that it made, during early access, when we started to see evidence that people liked it as much as they did, it is very motivating when and we were in the we're in the pandemic for a part of it and so on, like hearing from people who are like, man, everything is horrible, but I like Hades. It's just like, we can't fix the world, but there's this one small thing we can do. Like we can make this video game, keep doing the best we can with it. And we were so, again, talking about luck, like just our ability to withstand the pandemic as a small team accustomed to remote work. It just, I think that certainly for me personally, it helped. It was a motivating factor to just do the best we can, because so many people were not so lucky.
You done incredibly well. And one of the key things that comes back is obviously like your connection with players, and I always find it quite interesting because a lot of people, when they talk about Hades, it's the same way you talk about Darkest Dungeon as early access titles. Like it's an incredibly linear and fantastic way to create a relationship with the player community straight away. Do you think the value of player and user reviews is going to eventually be greater than that of media platforms, or is it already at that point?
I try not to think of them in competition in that way. I think there is immense value in thoughtful media criticism, and that is a profession and discipline. It's not the same as a customer review for like an individual game. I also find customer reviews incredibly valuable, not just as a game developer, just, when you're looking for a hotel or something, random stuff, like we use them. I'm sure everyone's experienced that customer reviews can be incredibly insightful and articulate on Steam and what have you. Like the more, the ones that are deemed more valuable by people can surface to the top, et cetera. It's all systems that have been iterated on heavily over time. I can't favor one over the other, because I myself was like, I was in both positions, right? I come from like being like a fan critic, writing fanzines and stuff like that. I didn't start as like a professional game critic or something like that. I loved reviewing the games that I played. So I like that there are ways for anyone to be able to do that. And at the same time, I've worked with incredibly like thoughtful critics whose broad base of knowledge across media that's unique to them, right? Because most people don't get to play as many games like as part of their lives as like maybe a game critic does. That gives them a unique perspective as well. So it's more symbiotic. A review from a gaming website, I don't know that it has the same exact goals as like a customer review or something like that. But yeah, I think people's relationship to media criticism certainly changes over time. We're not even, getting into stuff like Twitch TV and YouTube that that I think really like changed a lot of the way that people get opinions about games. Like in the early days of GameSpot, like getting access to a written review, screenshots that we took ourselves, videos that we took ourselves. It's like this was your best way of seeing what a game was like before making that decision of, do you want to spend your time and money on it? But now you could just hop on Twitch, just see someone playing it, right? You may not be the sort of person who wants to read a review or listen to someone talk about a game. You just want to see it played. That can be enough information for you. So I appreciate that there's just different ways of getting the information that you want about a game to make the decision that you want to, whether you just want to know what's interesting about the game, whether you're trying to decide, should I buy this game? Like people approach reviews and things like that from totally different perspectives. So I'm resistant to the idea that it kind of needs to be one way or the other. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think it's just because you've got this incredibly unique, I don't know anyone else, who's had your journey and has the ability to have experience in both areas.
Yeah.
You value, and Supergiant values your player community and the player community as a whole so highly. I'm like addicted to reviews. I've reviewed reviews like TripAdvisor, for example, like continuously, almost to fault. Right. So it's almost prohibitive because I won't do something if there's natural number of negative reviews, but then we forget that people are more likely to leave a negative review than a positive review. But I also think, media outlets, I love them for, I think, just a neutral point of information. Obviously, I find player reviews can be quite emotional sometimes, for better or for worse.
Right.
But we've had player reviews. We've had people on who have spoken about reviews for their games, and they got a negative review on Steam, and it was an indie title, but it was because the game wasn't a VR game, and they said this game would have been really good as a VR game.
Yeah,
gave them a negative review.
It's tough, but it's important to know when players expected something different than what they got from your game. Like coming from being a critic myself, I just like one of our things at Supergiant is like we don't refute the player's experience ever. Like your experience is what you had. If you had a miserable time and you're like, what the hell is this game where I have to replay it over and over? Like some people are mean to reviews like that. They're like, what are you, an idiot? It's a roguelike. It's a whole thing. But for other people, it's their first time experiencing something like that. They have a negative time, like realizing that they're the sense of like lost progress and stuff like that. And like we just try to be empathetic around that. Like not everybody comes at everything from the same context. We'll have some players that have been playing roguelikes, for decades, and other people for whom it may be the very first one. And like, it's okay to like, not everybody has the same sort of
they're gonna know
game literacy and stuff like that. It doesn't invalidate the experience of someone who just, expected something else. It's all feedback. We can't make everybody happy, but if we understand why the unhappy players are unhappy, in some cases, maybe it's something that's addressable. In other cases, maybe we're comfortable saying like, yeah, this wasn't the right game for them. I mean, there's so much feedback. You have to try to not fall into the trap of like getting angry with players who have a different perspective on it than what you hoped they would have or something like that. It is tough though, because it's something that you're putting everything you have into.
You put your heart into it, don't you?
It's like that's, we don't get to live in a world where we have these platforms that let us put our work out in front of everybody in the world, but then also either you can have a world where you can put your work out in front of everybody to see, but then what comes with that is the part where anybody can then respond to the work. It's like you don't get to have it both ways, I think. It used to be that as a small developer, you couldn't publish a game at all. Like only big companies could do it because the game had to go in a store. So it's all, I get that it's like a double-edged sword. It's the scary part of putting work out into the world. Like some people aren't going to like it. Not everybody's going to be nice about it.
No, I mean, wait till you put a bad game out, then
I've worked on games that the audiences can be against it, the whole way through from the moment it's announced. People can be like, why are you making this? And it's really hard. It's really hard even when people are excited for what you're doing. So yeah, I don't know. It's we try to do it anyway because we love it.
We sometimes spoke about, and I know that this is a thing that quite a few people now speak about, and this is why user reviews in some ways have more value. And it's about the conflict of interest between media publications that write reviews and the companies that obviously advertise on those same websites, right? Now, naturally, games companies want to reach people who play games. So they're going to go through media platforms. But at the same time, if your main source of income as a media platform is those who obviously sponsor your content and advertise on your content, do you think there's a conflict of interests?
There can be. It depends on how a publication is set up and what rules they put in place, what lines they decide they will and won't cross. I think it just can vary quite a bit. At GameSpot, while I worked there, it was founded on a position of separation between the editorial department and the sales department, to the point where those departments rarely interacted, except occasionally, sort of one emissary to another. Part of the pitch on the sales side of GameSpot was that this is a trusted source of information with a lot of credibility with its readership. So the editorial is, you're welcome to advertise here and you'll reach a big audience of like in the know game players, but that's because the editorial department is structured in a certain way. There was never a situation of like, hey, we have this big advertiser, will you be favorable to their title? In fact, in most cases, we were like completely oblivious to whether those types of relationships existed. Now, there were times for sure where a publisher was displeased with our coverage, let's say with a review that a game did not review as well as the publisher might have hoped. And our rules around that were straightforward as well, which was that we are happy to address any factual inaccuracies in our review. Like if the review says there's 10 levels, but there are in fact 12, we will amend that and we will disclose that we made the amendment. And if it's something that might influence the rating on the game, we will consider that. But if you're like not happy that someone didn't like the game as much as you hoped that they would, we respect your feedback, but that is not something that we're going to address in any way other than acknowledging your dissatisfaction. Again, I left GameSpot in 2007, so this is practically like prehistoric. This is before the existence of things like Twitch, so I can only speak to my own experience. Of course, there was always a tension, but it felt more like a symbiotic relationship. And in symbiotic relationships, I think there can be that sort of tension where the publishers certainly benefited from big publications such as GameSpot and their reach and their ability to promote their products just by, covering them, as much as they would like to be able to shape exactly what was said about their products. Like, sorry, that's where you no longer have that kind of authority. You're going to have to take the good with the bad there and do your best to make a superior game that will then get the positive coverage that it deserves. The thing is, like, very frequently, like I think it's very uncommon, at least again in my time, in my limited experience, we would often be the sort of canary in the coal mine. Like we would have access to a game before the public, and occasionally there would be that game that everyone was excited about, but was might have been a little bit disappointing or not live up to expectations. And so audiences could be pretty upset about that, right? It's like, oh my God, there's no way that this isn't amazing. I was so excited about this game. How could you say it's not perfect? But a couple of weeks later, once everybody has it, they just come around to the same conclusion. It's somewhat uncommon for, at least again, our team. I think our team was pretty plugged in. It's the internet. Like your opinion is not going to be unique to you. There are going to be other people who experience something in almost exactly the same way. So you may go a little bit against the grain. You may say that this popular thing, you don't like it. It's not as good as everyone else is saying. But there's probably a big population of people who also share that view. They may not be the majority of people, but they will be like, yeah, this thing is, overrated. It's not that great. And conversely, there were certainly cases where games that got like, so-so reviews elsewhere, we were like, this game is amazing. And we gave it higher marks than other sites did. So that's what worked for us then. I think the types of review content that people look for today is really quite different in a lot of ways. I think the value of like the individual, like personal perspective has risen more and more, whereas like our style was more this like monolithic kind of second person, we didn't put ourselves into our reviews, although it did sort of shift because we did video reviews as well. So the video reviews are very personal or relatively personal because you see someone right there, talking about their experience, but the written reviews were more written in a different style. Anyway, that's all. Like I said, it's kind of ancient history and things have evolved past that, but we didn't run into too many issues. To come back to your question, our solution to conflict of interest was to have clear rules that we did not break.
Yeah. Because of user reviews, you see what people think quite publicly. I know they're quite skewed sometimes, but again, if you've got 100,000 people giving a score, the aggregate is normally going to be quite close. Unless something gets review bombed, obviously.
Yeah.
But I think, and then obviously if that's quite far away, and I guess this must be quite hard for platforms like, Kotaku, IGN, etc., especially platforms where there's a score involved, because you have like this numerical value to something's worth, when actually that's probably more challenging because people have an expectation depending on what that number is. Whereas if it's just a thumbs up or a thumbs down, it's quite, you can read more into that, I guess. You've obviously won an incredible amount of awards. And you could say, like, you've clocked what you're doing extremely well. What is next for you?
We don't know yet, and it usually takes us a while for something to coalesce. Like we've been working on Hades. We've continued to work on it for more than a year, or for about a year since the version 1.0 launch. The version 1.0 launch was September 17th of last year, and in August of this year, we had the big Xbox and PlayStation launch, which was a big undertaking for us. So we get to kind of take stock of everything and think about what we want to do from here. Though in broad terms, things we're sure about are that we want to stick together as a small team and keep making games together, whichever form they may take. Games that I think are true to our values. And that's always been our goal from project to project. Like once our first game, Bastion, came out and thankfully was well received, and we realized we were in a position to stick together and carry on, we're like, great, let's just make something else. And then came Transistor, and that did well enough for us to be able to stick together and fund another project. So then we made Pyre, and then we made Hades. We just want to see how long we can keep going for as a small team, and as long as people out there, as long as we continue to enjoy doing what we're doing, and we absolutely still do, and as long as audiences out there enjoy the result of our efforts, we hope to just keep it up. It's important to us to surprise ourselves, to do things that are a bit kind of new creative challenges for us. By definition, we don't know exactly what that is, and we don't plan our titles. We don't have like a queue of games that we want to make. We only start to consider what's next once we're done with the project that we've been working on. Like some of that is practical, some of it almost feels superstitious. We don't know how we're going to feel at the end of a project. So to feel like we've already kind of committed to something before we're done with the thing that we're working on, something feels dishonest about it to us. We want to make the game that we're most excited to make, but we don't know what that is until we're kind of more in the moment and prepared to start working on it. And then while we're working on something, we just don't even plan farther ahead than that for the same reason. Anytime we've thought we knew what we might make next in advance, we have ended up not doing that. And we usually haven't even given that any thought for the same reason. So yeah, Transistor, we only started talking about months after Bastion had launched. We didn't think even an iota about what game we might make after Bastion, because it didn't matter what we might want to, all that mattered was that we do a good job. If we could do a good job with Bastion, then that would put us in a position to then maybe be able to make another game after that. But let's not sort of count our chickens before they hatch. I think that was kind of the mindset. We've been doing that ever since.
Yeah, it's a great success. Cool. I mean, final question. Could you summarize your time in games, like your career, in a sentence?
It's been a roller coaster ride for sure, and one that I have been looking forward to since I was a little kid, and it never has a dull moment, that's for sure.
That's brilliant. Greg, you've been, incredible. It's been so good to have you on. An absolute pleasure. Thoroughly enjoyed it. And just so everyone's aware, like all the opinions that you've heard on this episode are those of Greg's and my own and do not represent our employers. And if you'd like to reach out to us, it's gamedevshow@ptw.com. Greg, take care. Great work. And we'll speak soon.
Yeah, thank you. Take care.
Game over.